There does seem to be a bit of an issue on both sides of politics about fiscal responsibility, and they seem to both be throwing it out the window as they're desperately sprinting to May 3 and trying to get their votes.
With the confidentiality, obviously, there's a lack of transparency.
I just wonder, if you've got $32 billion worth of assets under management on behalf of 65,000 clients, does this stuff keep you up at night?
Oh, hell yeah.
The ASX has really been starved of IPOs since then. It's become quite a problem for the local market.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over NBR's top video stories from the past week. First, as Australia's election campaign heats up, both major parties are locked in a high-stakes bidding war for first-home buyer votes, unleashing bold and fiscally risky housing policies. Correspondent in Sydney, Lachlan Cahoon, has more.
Australia is counting down to an election on May 3rd, and the polls right now are showing that the Labor government is on track to be returned. Struggling in the polls, the opposition has made a bold policy announcement on housing as it aims to win the votes of younger people and key marginal electorates. NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Colquhoun is bringing us up to speed with the Aussie election in his underarm column this week. And Lachlan, what is this new opposition policy?
Mike, they've really rolled the dice on this one. This is one of the boldest policy moves in some time. It's a policy which would allow first home buyers to deduct the interest on their mortgages for 5 years. So there is an income threshold, $175,000 a year for singles and $250K for couples. But this would deliver savings for singles of around $11,000 a year. So if you earn $175,000 in Australia, each year you pay about $53,000 in tax, right? So an $11,000 saving on your tax for paying your mortgage and being a homeowner, that brings your tax bill down to $40,000 every year for 5 years. So it's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad at all if you can get it. Does the government have an alternative to this?
Yeah, so the government has two policies, one of which is already in place. They have a home guarantee where, in Australia, you need a 20% deposit to purchase a house. But the government scheme guarantees 15% of that. So it effectively means that you can go and get a home loan with only 5% of the value of the house as a deposit. So the other one, which is probably the bigger one, is a shared equity scheme, which is possibly as outrageous as or audacious perhaps as the coalition scheme, is the government will take 30% equity in an existing home or 40% home equity in a new build, and the homeowner only has to pay the bank. So the 30% that the government owns just sits there. You can pay it down if you want, or when you sell the house, you pay them out. So it's interest-free, and it's available to 10,000 applicants each year for 5 years. So, we're entering into this bizarre situation where there's almost an auction for votes out there in the suburbs of the major cities for young home buyers who are trying to get into the property ladder. There's an auction going on for their votes, and both parties have got their own sort of propositions for them.
Yeah. Well, Lachlan, I know you would have run your wonderful analytical eye over both policies. So what are the pros and cons?
Well, most analysts say both schemes would push up house prices because, of course, there'd be a tremendous influx in demand. I've seen some calculations that they reckon that the house prices would go up by about 15% if either of these schemes were fully implemented, particularly the coalition scheme, which is much more wide-ranging. So in some ways, that would be self-defeating. So it would put homes even further out of the reach of many people. Then there's the impact on the national finances. The recent budget that the government brought down only a few weeks ago in late March. God, it seems like forever ago. That forecast, budget deficits in Australia out to the horizon with no sign of a budget surplus. So the opposition reckons its tax deductions, its mortgage payment holiday would cost the budget about 1.5 billion Australian dollars, but that's disputed. Economists have done their modelling and they reckon it would be between as much as 8 billion. The government had $30 billion in cost of living relief and giveaways in its recent budget. So there does seem to be a bit of an issue on both sides of politics about fiscal responsibility, and they seem to both be throwing it out the window as they're desperately sprinting to May 3 and trying to get their votes.
Yeah, I wonder why. What is the political context for these announcements with the election just weeks away?
Yeah, sorry, as you said in your intro, it's in the context that Labor seems to be pulling ahead. We had a number of the polls are indicating this. I'm talking to right today. There was a Resolve poll, which they work for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, those newspapers. That poll this week had the government on 53.5% versus the coalition on 46.5%, and of course we have a preferential system that's two-party preferred. So that would give probably give the Labor government a majority back in government. I mean, there's a whole argument that they'll fall short of a majority and have to have a minority government, but at 53.5%, sorry, they would probably be re-elected with a majority. So opposition leader Peter Dutton hasn't been cutting through. He was the favourite a few months ago, but there's been a big turnaround. I mean, he seemed underprepared. His identification with Donald Trump was seen as a big plus a few months ago, but that's no longer the case anymore. And there have been backflips on policy. They had a policy to stop public servants working from home. That was incredibly unpopular, so they backflipped on that. They wanted to sack about 40,000 public servants. That didn't play very well. So they've backflipped on that. And there's also the signature energy policy, which is for Australia to have nuclear energy. That hasn't been very popular either. So they've been really struggling in the polls, not getting the cut through. And so the opposition had their policy launch last Sunday, and they pulled out this new housing policy. It seems like a roll of the dice to really sort of get people's attention and possibly change the momentum as we count down to May 3.
Back home, a controversial new bill backed by the ACT Party aims to simplify employment termination through mutual consent, sparking debate over whether it will reduce legal costs for businesses or erode key protections for workers. BE Employment Law Associate Sam Delamere speaks with co-editor Hamish McNichol.
Sam, there's been an amendment bill related to employment relations come through last week. Can you just tell us what it is?
Yeah, so this is a bill that would essentially allow employers to make an offer of payment to employees for the purpose of reaching an agreement to end the employee's employment. Importantly, there doesn't need to be an employment relationship problem already in place. And then the discussions leading up to that offer and the offer themselves would be considered pre-termination negotiations, and these would be protected, so they wouldn't be able to be brought up by the employee as the basis for a personal grievance. So effectively, the offer and all the discussions leading up to it are privileged. The bill does contain some protections, so the pre-termination negotiations can't be relied upon if they involve an element of dishonesty or unlawfulness. Mm-hmm. And also there's some basic requirements for the agreement, if that's, that stage is reached, has to be written, has to refer to the relevant law, and probably most importantly, the employer has to have advised the employee that they can seek legal advice about the agreement.
So how is this different from the status quo?
So under the current law, you can't, you can, but it's quite treacherous. There has to be a employment relationship problem in place. So there has to be a dispute, or there has to be a personal grievance, because otherwise if there's not and the employer is coming to the employee, it's highly likely that the employee has quite a good personal grievance there. So basically it's allowing for these sort of discussions to happen without the employer having that threat of a personal grievance being raised.
So what are the benefits of what's sought in this amendment bill then?
So one of them is because you have the sort of confidentiality of the discussions, sort of opens up freer dialogue in sort of termination situations. So that's quite good. That also lends itself to providing the employer with an option, how they want to manage their business. Now this is an option that they can sort of talk with the employee to maybe move them on. Mm-hmm. And then another potential benefit is reduced costs, because you've got this framework. If this bill passes and becomes law, you've got this framework setting out how these sort of situations are dealt with. So then there's not really the need for, there's not excessive legal costs because you're not figuring out how you need to go about it.
The downsides as well, though? What are the potential negative consequences of this?
So with the confidentiality, obviously, there's a lack of transparency. So there's not, it's just between the employer and employee, so there's no sort of oversight. And also that means that because they've got the protection of those pre-termination negotiations, they can't be brought up at a later stage. So that's really quite a significant downside for employees. Arguably, because in the employment relationship, there's inherently sort of a power imbalance. So this is kind of adding to that in a way, because, there is the possibility, for example, that, a bad faith employer comes to the employee and says, hey, you're either going to be dismissed or, you're exited on these terms. And, dismissal looks far worse than being...
Yeah, and I think that's some of the more vocal criticism I've seen, is that this is fairly in favour of the employer, or at least it feels like it would be.
Yeah, I mean, the personal grievances is sort of one of the measures that an employee has to keeping employers in check, and taking that away in these sort of situations is quite significant.
Okay. What are the next steps then for this bill? When's it going to become a law?
So it had its first reading last Wednesday, and had the support of the coalition government. So now it goes to select committee to be reviewed. Public can have submissions on it, and then it goes to its second and third reading. So importantly, while National and ACT have said they're going to support it, generally New Zealand First has said they'll only support it to the select committee and then sort of see from there.
Right.
So it remains to be seen whether it's going to have majority support through the second and third, and then potentially become law.
Do you think businesses are broadly in favour of this sort of amendment?
I think so, because it gives them more options in these sort of situations. But there has been some criticism of it, like the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions has said it's not really necessary. We've already got mediation and those sort of techniques in place, and this is not really adding to it. But it's you can see both sides.
On the NBR podcast, shareholders in Craig's Investment Partners are due for a tidy payout after selling 50% of the company to private equity firm TA Associates. Chief Executive Simon Tong talks with Simon Shepherd.
Simon Tong now heads up Craig's Investment Partners. It manages $32 billion of Kiwis' money in rather volatile times. But that hasn't stopped a global private equity firm buying half of Craig's for more than $100 million. So, what happens now? I just wonder, if you've got $32 billion worth of assets under management on behalf of 65,000 clients, does this stuff keep you up at night?
Oh, hell yeah.
But will it also create a war chest for future acquisitions? Have you got your eye on something?
I think acquisitions
or
growth
partnerships or growth.
Growth is definitely part of the picture.
If you had a greatest hits, or there was a theme of an album, what would your album be?
Well, I think it would be, have a go, take the opportunity, because, the thing that I've benefited most from is people giving me a chance to jump between different industries.
And that episode of the NBR podcast will be available free wherever you get your podcasts on Tuesday. Or for early access to new episodes, you can subscribe on mbr.co.nz. Bain Capital's long-awaited flow to Virgin Australia faces fresh turbulence as global market volatility, driven by Donald Trump's erratic tariff moves, threatens to derail the airline's third IPO attempt. Here's Lachlan Cahoon with this week's NBR Shoe Shine.
NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Cahoon is looking at the Virgin float in Shoe Shine column this week. Lachlan, bring us up to speed on the path Virgin has taken to the IPO.
Well, Kiwis might remember, Will, that Air New Zealand actually had about a 25% stake in Virgin back in the last decade. I think they sold out about 2016 or so. They had 25% of the company. I think they got about $350 million for that, Australian. Probably a good move because Virgin went into administration in 2020 during the pandemic. And then it was bought out of administration by Bain Capital, the private equity group, for about 3.5 billion Australian dollars. And they've been nursing it back to health since then. It's a very different airline now. In 2020, they had an ambitious international network. They were running a low-cost carrier in the Australian market called Tiger, which I think they'd bought from a Singaporean company. So the pandemic hit when they were really overextended. So as part of the rebuild, Qatar Airways has recently taken a 25% stake. That was given the green light in February. And that's been very well received by the market to have a well-capitalised international shareholder. And that kind of prepared things for the float.
But this is the third time the IPO has actually been attempted. What's happened in the other attempts?
Well, the first attempt, I think, was in 2022 or 23, and they had a look at it then. Investors told them that they didn't think the company was ready. They needed to continue the rebuild. So they were ready to go again last year, but it all went very quiet. And obviously, they were then talking to Qatar about their investment. So they had to go through that process of getting Qatar on board. That needed to be approved by the government. It was. Now they have all their ducks lined up, so they're hoping it's third time lucky. So they've been meeting with investors. They've appointed investor relations staff and advisors, and the expectation has been that the process will kick off by June.
And so is the airline actually in good shape now?
Well, it is actually in good shape. It has a third of the domestic market. The domestic market's worth $17 billion a year. It started to turn a profit. 2023 was its first profit in 11 years. They made $519 million. 6 months to December was even better, $439 million. They have a new chief executive, Dave Emerson. He was previously the chief commercial officer, and he was working with the previous CEO to build the company back up. So if ever there was a good time for a float, it has been now, you know. But of course, the ASX really needs it as well. The only major big float that we've had last year was the Guzman y Gomez, a Mexican food chain, and that was worth $2.2 billion. That was last year's biggest IPO. The ASX has really been starved of IPOs since then. It's become quite a problem for the local market. So they reckon about 40% of Virgin could be sold off in the float. So that's possibly around 1.5 billion IPO, which would be great for the local market.
Then you've got the Trump-related market dynamics just at the moment. So how's that going to affect things?
Well, the timing couldn't be worse, because I think that they had a big meeting with all the investors at the end of March. 2 weeks later, we had all the Trump tariff turmoil. The market slumped. So they would have been pretty confident going into that meeting in March that they'd get a good reception, and I think they did. But now the float would be taking off into a very, very different and much more uncertain environment. So is it a good time for an IPO right now? You've got to ask that question. I mean, Qantas shares, for example, which is another reason why they've been saying, look, you know, it's time to invest in airlines again. Qantas shares have went up 70% over the last year. They announced their first dividend in quite some time, but Qantas shares went back more than 10% in the most recent correction over the last couple of weeks. So, but the word is the float is going ahead. They're going to roll the dice, but it's certainly going to be taking off into a much more uncertain environment.
And on next week's Shoe Shine, senior journalist Nicholas Poynton looks at the bemusing world of patsy directors. That's out on Tuesday on mbr.co.nz. And thanks again for joining us this Easter Sunday from the whole team. See you next week.